Hello again, everyone, and welcome back. This is the third and, yes, final part of our Chapter 24 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This final section is entitled The Freedom Movement. The focus question for this section is, what were the major thrusts of the civil rights movement in this period? Now, with the benefit of hindsight, the causes of the upsurge in civil rights activity in this period seem clear, but at the time, the civil rights revolution came as a great surprise to many Americans. Undergirding this surge was World War II's destabilization of the racial system, the mass migration out of the South that began in the 19-teens and continued in this period that made black voters a larger part of the Democratic Party's coalition. Also, the Cold War and the rise of the independent Third World, both of which exposed the gap between U.S. rhetoric and the realities of the American experience at home. The Southern Black Church became the organizational power for an all-out assault on segregation and Jim Crow. Church leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as leaders of this movement. Other contributing factors, of course, were the persistence of Jim Crow laws in the South and racial segregation in schools. Indeed, it was the issue of segregation in schools where the civil rights movement of the 1950s made its first attack against Jim Crow and segregation in general. Probably the most famous of the court cases involving school desegregation was Brown versus the Board of Education. And this was really the peak of Thurgood Marshall, a very famous black lawyer, and the NAACP's assault on public school segregation. Oliver Brown's case was brought to court because his daughter was forced to walk across railroad tracks rather than attend their neighborhood white school. Marshall argued that segregation was inherently unequal, going against that old separate but equal decision of the Supreme Court in the 1890s. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court Earl Warren's court struck down segregation in public education. This produced a wave of optimism, even though it was a limited decision. Indeed, the optimism produced by the Brown versus Board of Education case soon translated into further action against Jim Crow and segregation throughout the South. One of the more famous incidents was that of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. Miss Parks very famously refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, which led to her arrest and a subsequent court case involving the issue of segregation on public transportation in the South. Rosa's arrest led to the African American community in Montgomery to boycott the city bus line. And for 381 days, African Americans stayed off the buses and instead walked a road in an informal network of taxis. Of course, the boycott hurt the city's finances as the African American community was one of the largest communities that actually use public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama in this period. And of course, if you want action to occur, you have to hit them where it hurts the most, in the wallets. And that was the goal of this bus boycott, and it worked wonderfully. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public transportation was unconstitutional. The Montgomery bus boycott launched a movement for racial justice as a nonviolent crusade based in Southern black churches. And this is where Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as the most vocal and visible proponent of this nonviolent civil rights crusade. The language of freedom pervaded the movement. Issues of political rights, economic opportunities, eradicating historic wrongs and violence, and and the very essence and nature of human dignity itself. King's leadership style used protesters' understandings of freedom to undergird the issues of racial injustice in the United States. His I Have a Dream speech in 1963 established the philosophy of color blindness towards racial justice, which really established the foundation for issues of racial justice and civil rights up until more recent times. Also, King's advocacy and use of peaceful civil disobedience stood in stark contrast to the government's use of violence against peaceful protesters and greatly galvanized huge amounts of sympathy and empathy for the African American community because of their use of peaceful civil disobedience. King's use of the Bible to preach justice and forgiveness also tapped in to the very deep religious streak in American society at this time to further reveal the issues of racial injustice. King and other African American church leaders soon formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was an organization of black churches organized by King to fight segregation in the United States. Without national backing, however, local action was not enough to overturn Jim Crow, and the efforts to do so were met with a racist campaign which paralyzed the progress of civil rights in much of the South. Southern white leaders issued the Southern Manifesto, where Southern congressional leaders declared the Brown decision as an abuse of judicial power and states' rights, and vowed to fight back against desegregation efforts, and state after state in the South passed laws to block desegregation. Congress did pass a national civil rights law in 1957, but the law had very weak enforcement provisions and really wasn't worth the paper it was written on and was a dead letter before it even arrived. In general, Eisenhower failed to provide moral leadership on issues of civil rights in the 1950s. He did, however, dispatch federal troops to ensure the court-ordered integration of the Little Rock, Arkansas Central High School, the infamous case of the Little Rock Nine, who you see in this photograph right here. The pace of school desegregation, however, in general slowed due to the massive resistance from Southern leaders in this period, and many schools did not fully desegregate until the 1970s. For the election of 1960, the Republicans nominated Vice President Richard Nixon. For their part, the Democrats nominated a Catholic, John F. Kennedy, who did face some challenges because of general anti-Catholic sentiment, but did manage to secure his party's nomination. Kennedy warned of a missile gap, basically arguing that the Soviet Union had far more nuclear warheads than the United States did, which convinced many people that new leadership was needed. In general, Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline, who you see here in this photograph, represented the hope for a youthful, vigorous presidency. And this race featured the first televised presidential debate, where Kennedy's youth and rugged good looks definitely helped ingratiate him with the American public and further revealed just how television transformed American politics, particularly in this debate where a young, energetic Kennedy stood in stark contrast to an older, less attractive, more visibly nervous and anxious Richard Nixon. And Nixon faced tremendous backlash for his debate performance, where Kennedy faced great praise for his poise and performance on the debate stage. Despite this, Kennedy won by only 120,000 votes out of 69 million cast, a very tight race. The end of the 1950s seemed to signal trouble on the horizon that belied the Ozzie-inherit image that was portrayed on television screens around the country. Eisenhower's farewell address warned of the dangers of the military-industrial complex, which he defined as a huge military establishment and permanent arms industry, which endangered our liberties and democratic processes. Other underpinnings of 1950s life were also in disarray. Environmental problems from cars, chlorofluorocarbons damaging the ozone layer, insecticides on corporate farms, housewives rebelling from strict family and gender norms, and blacks unsatisfied with the slow progress of racial change. And that concludes part 3, the final part of our Chapter 24 lecture series for your textbook Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. As always, I hope you learned a lot. Until next time, study hard, and I'll see you soon.